I'm going to be a bit challenging here and suggest that Waugh kind of thinks again in terms of the difference between feeling happy and the notion of, well, what is the truth, or
truth.
the fulfill, or reconciliation, or those things. And I'm just going to throw this out. I mean, one, as far as I know, Jesus never said to anybody, come follow me and I'll make you happy.
My friends, I hope many of you will consider starting a reading group in your own parish and join us in reading Brideshead Revisited and other transformative stories written by Catholics throughout the ages.
Our guest is Dr. Peter Sinclair, who is the chair of the Languages and Literature Department here at Sacred Heart University. A lovely place, and really, and I was just talking before we started, I'd like to come and take your class, as a matter of fact. We're beginning a new series here for the diocese on literature, Catholic literature. And it interests me that of all the books to pick as the first one, why Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited?
I would suggest right off the bat, well, one, it is an enduring classic. It's hard to, it keeps coming back somehow, even when it's fallen out of favor in the past. But part of it is the challenge of the novel itself. And the way I could put it is, I first read the novel when I was 16 years old. I was a couple months away from my confirmation. The novel was given to me by my AP English teacher, who was a former nun, who did have some bones to pick with the Catholic Church, and she gave it to me, telling me that Brideshead Revisited is a scathing satire of Catholicism.
Well, to a degree, she was right.
Right, and her claim was, and she kind of gave me a little preface to the novel, which was that it features a young man who meets a rich, young, eccentric Sebastian Flight, who's a member of the wealthy Flight family that happens to be Catholic, and that this family is, the way she put it, sort of malignantly controlling of the family, and that Lady Marchmain's Catholicism drives everybody into drunkenness, madness, and dissolution. And she ended by saying, and the protagonist neither gets married nor lives happily ever after. And I remember her words. She said, "Satire, Mr. Sinclair. Allow it to reform you."
Well, I hate to say this, but maybe your teacher, when I read it, that was actually my feeling. I was thinking, if I weren't Catholic, I don't know that I'd want to become one.
Well, exactly.
After having read this thing.
Well, now I was 16, so
yes.
I didn't have, I was reading, but I didn't have the sophisticated vocabulary to sort of describe how this novel actually deeply resonated with me.
Right.
I was ambivalent about my Mrs. Garber, who I still love, her prefacing of the book, but I wasn't sure how to articulate how it resonated, except that I identified a great deal with Sebastian.
Yes.
I didn't know why, and it haunted me. What happened to him? You know, what pushed him to such a rapid decline, and dipsomania, the alcoholism, and just the horrible sort of decline of Sebastian, which always sort of haunted me.
Well, there was a decline of a lot of people in that family.
The whole novel.
My wife, who's a psychiatric nurse practitioner, loves the book from a family systems point of view, and saying, this dysfunctional family, much of this dysfunction caused around religion.
Right. So I sort of, like you said, it was hard for me not to agree with Mrs. Garber. However, shortly after college, I watched the miniseries, the Granada television.
That was our series when I was president. Actually, I was president shortly after that of public television. And that series was a huge success, one of the finest broadcasts public television ever made, with some of the most important actors in history.
Right.
But yet, the big controversy then was it was a gay theme, because there was this subtle gay theme running through the book with Charles and Sebastian. And so that was all, of course, all over the press.
Which I say, I can't believe sometimes critics are still debating
Isn't that
about their
amazing?
relationship.
Yeah,
by
yeah.
like, what is it, platonic or romantic? When clearly it is what it is at the time. But yes, you're right. That series was, it's almost the blueprint for the limited series television.
Yes.
I mean,
It's
what
one of the
we have
great.
today.
I'm watching it again. It's fabulous.
And I recommend it to anybody.
Yeah, right.
for this. But what it did, and this is unusual because I don't think I've had this experience with any other work of literature, it brought me back to the work of literature, and it enriched my reading of it.
I think
and
you're right.
I came to kind of I understood better then what it is about Sebastian Flight and kind of how things are being depicted in this novel that I identified with drawing. One was, I was identifying first, of course, on a personal level. I'm Catholic, but it's a Catholicism I've struggled with. I have tried to flee my Catholicism in my life in the past, yet something keeps drawing me back. I mean, here I am. I'm going to spend the rest of my academic career at a Catholic university, and I did so because I wanted to come here. I ended up, Brideshead Revisited became the inspiration for me to continue to read other Catholic novels, which led to me to write my dissertation on 20th-century British Catholic novelists who were all converts, like Evelyn Waugh was. But what I recognized that was drawing me to Sebastian was something that sometimes I think can be misunderstood about him, that sometimes he's depicted as kind of the sort of like this
loser?
This is what happens, this is what in a moral tale one should avoid. But no, the way the novel is designed, if you look at the design as a whole, except for the short prologue and epilogue, it's got two main books, In Arcadia Ego and The Twitch Upon the Thread, book 2. And so in the first book, what you have are all of these characters, a very profane life, the decadence Waugh likes to depict. And everybody in this Catholic family and everybody else becomes alienated, scattered, dissolute, in decline, falling apart. And it would appear as if religion is kind of
tearing them
thing
apart.
that's happening. But the second book, the Twitch Upon the Thread, which is the title of it, is a main clue. It's an allusion to G.K. Chesterton, and it's worth Cordelia, who is a character who gets very underrated in this novel. She explains that it refers to Father Brown, the detective in the Chesterton stories, who was very popular and was during Waugh's time. And he claimed that the way he would catch the criminal is not through necessarily physical evidence, but he had an invisible fishing line, an invisible hook, and he could toss it anywhere in the world and wait for that twitch upon thread and draw him in or her in. And that becomes for Waugh the overarching image of what Waugh claimed is the theme of the novel, the operation of God's grace in the world, even in the most profane of settings like Brideshead. And what you do see in that book too is all the characters, one by one, they're coming back, including Sebastian. So Sebastian, why he's so haunting is, if you look in book 1 with his relationship with Charles, the topic of Catholicism comes up because Charles is curious about it. He thinks it's a goofy thing, and why are you? He equates it to his teddy bear, like a foible. But Sebastian does say, well, foolish as it sounds, I believe it. And he says something very telling. He can't remember who he's quoting, but he says, I pray every day, oh God, make me good, but not yet, which is obviously St. Augustine.
Yeah, right. That's exactly it.
And Cordelia, in what Waugh claims to be the most important passages in the novel, which is towards the end, the last conversation she has with Charles, gives the story of what happens to Sebastian. And what is clear to me is that Sebastian, you could call it a calling, whatever you might want to call it, he knows he's being called, but he doesn't. It terrifies him. He doesn't want to go there. He wants to stay a little boy. It frightens him.
Yes.
Terribly, and he drinks and to try to escape it. That's why, I'm not saying it's exactly why, but it's a main reason why I think he tries everything possible to flee the family, flee the country, but where does he end up constantly in the sort of late novel and Cordelia's story? He keeps trying to go to monasteries.
Right.
And they'll take him in. He doesn't say, I want to be a monk. He always just says, what can I do to help? He'll stay for a month or two, supposedly, but then he'll disappear. And off on another bender, and then keeps crawling back. And, I think at the last we hear of Sebastian, he is an under porter in a monastery in Tunisia. And it's a telling, so it's to say that when Sebastian claims in his mocking way, like my sister, I'm half heathen. It's also him, sort of the ambivalence that tears him apart. He knows he's called, he knows he has faith, but he can't go there. He can't do it. That ambivalence, I would say, tears him apart. Now, obviously, too, in a more sort of psychoanalytic way, one could say sexuality obviously is tearing him apart on this position also. Unfortunately, Charles, the narrator, the narrator, Charles Ryder, it was a daring move for Waugh, who never usually used first-person narration, to narrate this from the first-person narrator of Charles Ryder, who is at best an agnostic, but who's generally thinks Catholicism is goofy, silly, and is hostile towards it.
The terms Charles used were, the Catholic religion is superstition and trickery. That's basically what
he calls it. Mumbo jumbo, witchcraft too.
Yeah, witchcraft.
Yeah, and so you're getting it through that point of view of somebody who it's an outsider point of view. And I've always said, anytime you read a work of literature that features a protagonist who's a bystander, an outsider, you have to be a little suspicious, right, of that point of view and what's happening with it. And sometimes we call it the unreliable narrator. And what I think is fascinating with Charles' narration is he's his own unreliable narrator because he doesn't realize that the sort of the invisible thread of God's grace is pulling him in too. And I would argue it's the actual act of narration, telling, that makes him find his way to what we're supposed to believe is he himself converts then at the end.
Yes.
He sees,
everybody,
he recognizes.
I have heard it said that the name Brideshead Revisited, by the name Brideshead, which is the name of this big estate, quite lovely in the TV version, is really a metaphor for the church. And the head is, of course, Jesus.
Yeah.
Have
it's
you
hard.
heard that? Is that
what
you'd
yes,
say?
I have. The novel doesn't directly say it, but
No,
it suggests that you have Christ as head of church, the bride, Mary, or and that kind of thing, although the novel doesn't suggest that. Actually, Waugh denied that was the case.
Oh, really?
As far as I know. However, people often would ask him, he would get ridiculous questions. People would often ask him, if bride's head is the church, is Lady Marchmain kind of God, quote unquote, which weirdly he said, well, maybe, but authors like to play around with characters. But there is, like Cordelia says, a kind of way that Lady Marchmain, who is, by the way, flawed, like all the characters are flawed. They're all flawed.
I'd say highly.
Right, highly flawed. A way to think of sin, the way that Waugh thinks of it in Catholic novelists, is the root definition of sin. Missing the mark is the root definition of sin.
Oh, really?
And Waugh probably is aware of that, and everybody kind of misses the mark. But what I find wonderful about the Catholic novel itself is it always depicts not a sense of sort of a predestination to damnation or total depravity, because the world it depicts, which was one thing that I love about Waugh's novel, it makes it unique amongst his other novels, is he has a very generous view of humankind, despite all the flaws in here, because everybody has an opportunity at redemption. There's no,
and they all come back,
and they come back,
and every one of them comes back, including Charles. Now let's talk. We're talking about him, but we're not talking about him specifically, and that is Evelyn Waugh, the author. Want to set him up a little bit,
Sure.
And this is 1944 when he wrote the book, right after the Second World War, etc.
During the war, actually, in 43.
Mm-hmm.
I was just talking outside. I forget who it was, and this is gonna slay you. He wrote Brideshead Revisited in 3 months.
3 months.
During medical leave during World War II. He was a soldier in World War II, and he was in a couple different brigades. Everybody hated him. He was a horrible soldier. Mm-hmm. And he had a parachuting exercise. He wounded his leg, and they gave him a few months medical leave. And during that time, he wrote Brideshead Revisited. Yes. And published it in 1945. Mm-hmm. But Waugh himself, the author, he was,
he was not a Catholic, right, when he wrote this?
He was.
Oh, he was. Okay.
This is the interesting thing about Waugh. He converted. He was a Catholic convert. Mm-hmm. And there was a wave of these Catholic converts in England after World War I, like Graham Greene.
So he converted after World War I.
Chesterton was a convert.
Oh, okay. I didn't know
so
that.
Waugh, who was born of a publishing family, Arthur Waugh, actually was a very successful publisher, whose fame was publishing Charles Dickens novels. So he grew up with that. He went to Oxford 1922 to 1923. He was an aesthete, avant-garde kind of guy who really didn't pay attention to his academics, lost his scholarship. But he got a lot of nice inspiration from Oxford for Brideshead, and then decided to dedicate himself to writing. And it was hard, like any writer at first, but in 1929 he published Decline and Fall, his first novel. That was a commercial success. And then through the 30s into the 40s, he had a whole string of these hard, chiseled, which he became famous for, satirical novels, satires of British aristocracy, of British modern decadence and the loss of traditional values, and typical everything is spiraling, civilization in decline kind of a thing. And very funny and wonderfully written. But nothing in his life or in these novels betrayed any religious inclinations. However, part of Waugh's career is divided between writing novels, and the other part is he was a social kind of climber. He liked to make all kinds of friends with aristocrats and personalities. And somehow that led to him with a few important contacts. One was the Lygon family, Hugh Lygon and the family, which is a big aristocratic Catholic family in England. Madersford, do I have it right? Court was their big landed estate, which became the inspiration of Brideshead, and became a kind of second home for Waugh. But he also privately started meeting with a famous Jesuit, Father Darcy, at the time. We're not sure how long, like maybe a couple of years, and gained Catholic instruction. And when he converted, the announcement, 1930, was a big surprise to the public and an appalling shock to his high Anglican family, who, I don't know the details, but I think kind of sort of pushed them. Like, Waugh claimed that he didn't convert out of emotion, that it was the intellectual argument for God, and that it was he claimed it was the only option he felt.
Well, I mean, that's, of course, the beauty of the Catholic faith, the intellectual side, which is often missed. It's interesting that I said that my granddaughter just went to one of the top Catholic schools in America and studied theology, not to become a priest, but she has never read Bride. They're not even teaching it, and I can't believe it because the way you expound on it, I was thinking this has to be one of the most important books of the 20th century, the Catholic books of the 20th century.
Well, would say that that's where the challenge comes in is like when you read
Digging around the edges.
this novel.
Yeah.
The first 200 pages or so, you're wondering, okay, this is a Catholic novel.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Because
no, I'd say if I read this
it's
when I was 16, I'd say, and I was Catholic,
Yeah.
I'd say, well, I don't think I like the Catholic Church.
Right,
You know,
and
it's all-
then there's that too, and maybe we can discuss that also
Okay,
because again, and Waugh got this question, but so did Graham Greene and many other Catholic novelists. But with this novel, Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh was often asked, so this is a novel about Catholicism, and you're a Catholic. You don't seem to give any indication that Catholicism makes anybody happy.
Yeah, right. No proselytizing there.
Right. And Waugh thought that Waugh never really would directly respond to the question, and for good reasons, because for Waugh it was a dumb question.
Yeah.
Like the question isn't like, does Catholicism make you happy? For Waugh, the question would be, is Catholicism true?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And like Flannery O'Connor would claim, truth is truth.
Mm-hmm.
You can't bend your feelings to make truth something other than what it is. And so for Waugh, the question, and you brought up intellect, the whole notion of like, does it feel good to Waugh would have been kind of like, well, it has nothing to do with that. Is it true? Is it?
Yeah, and it's kind of like an interview we recently did for a TV series I'm doing, which is when asked about kind of the meaning of life to very bright person, and she said, it's not about being happy. It's about purpose, And I thought, wow,
perfect. Yes.
Really, she got it right. By the way, she's a Episcopal professor at Union Theological Seminary. At any rate, let's talk about what you said we missed a little bit, but it's important, which is this Catholic thing, this thing what I called on one side piety and rules, and then kind of the newer church of good works and love, and all these dynamics that are going, because really if you look at the book today, it was written at a time before Vatican II, and the church is even quite different. Do you want to dig around on
I will, which is another challenge for the
Yes,
novel,
it
for
is.
readers today.
Right.
My sense is that readers today would be more definitely drawn to the nostalgia of some kind of bygone
The old
era,
days,
the 1920s Oxford,
and
and
just after
luncheons with champagne.
The 1940s,
But,
after the Second World War, when I grew up, the Catholic Church was more about the kind of church she depicted, the rules and those kinds of things. A Lady March made.
Yeah. So Waugh, when he wrote this in 1945, obviously it's pre-Vatican II, and I will put it this way: as far as the rest of Waugh's biography goes, it's difficult to be generous sometimes with Waugh at this point. Mm-hmm. Post 1945 was not the world that Waugh wanted to live in.
Yeah, right.
He became he was always conservative. He became so conservative that and any scholar of Waugh wouldn't disagree with me that he becomes almost a caricature of the very things that he would satirize in his novels. Oh, really? He became like literally the cartoon figure of a snob, to the point that, and I know this for a fact because when I was younger, I knew people who knew Waugh.
Oh, really?
The word was that even the snobbiest people in England found his company insufferable. He couldn't stand the social reforms, the political changes, and then Vatican II, he thought was an abomination. When he died in 1966, the few that remained close to him claimed it was the thing that finally killed him.
Oh, really?
In a way, yeah. So so it can be difficult, right, to know that about Waugh. To know it is coming from, Waugh is coming from a pre-Vatican II, pretty conservative viewpoint, in the novel. At the same time, though, I guess a way I could put it is, in this novel, and it's an anomaly amongst his novels, Waugh actually his writing style is very different than anything he ever did before. Mm-hmm. It has a sort of expansive, romantic, descriptive, nostalgic style. It's longer than his other novels, and it takes in a kind of generous human scope that allows for kind of us to see things that Waugh never would show in any of his other works. Human frailty, and the ability to perhaps feel sympathetic for the human caught in what Waugh saw was a very difficult world now to live in which, how could I put it? We're in a time, and Waugh would have been aware of it, when belief in God for the first time in the scope of human history is an option, right? Of many, many other easier and more pleasurable options. And so it's in that way, I think, because you're right, the novel's not depicting a post-conciliar Catholic kind of vision of going out inviting for egalitarianism and social causes, because Waugh wouldn't stand that stuff. It doesn't have that in it, but instead it has a kind of a drama of human beings, yes, aristocrats, upper middle class people who are very flawed, but who are also human beings caught up at a time of immense, obviously, social, political change, World War II. One thing people forget about all the time when reading Brideshead is it's depicting a world right after World War I. The effects of World War I were tremendous on British consciousness.
And also, the super rich of that period, the landed gentry,
which disappeared after World War II.
Totally disappeared, and
right.
Also you get to see that kind of what I would call phoniness. There's plenty of that today, but different kinds.
Right.
How that kind of disappeared, and how that life of that artificial life, dug a little bit into that, where you could see the weaknesses and the frailties of all humanity, even those privileged people.
Which creates an irony with Waugh, because he bemoans the decline of landed gentry and aristocracy and that kind of traditional order. He does. He equates it with decline of civilization, whereas others post 1945 were rooting it on.
Yeah, right.
Me too, probably at that time. But the funny thing is that there is almost a kind of I don't know how I put this. A kind of he shows his hand a little too much, Waugh, because if you look at all, including Brideshead, but all his novels, he is viciously satirical about the aristocracy too.
Oh yes.
And you get that in Brideshead, and you get it in his other masterpiece, Handful of Dust, where those who are trying to cling to some traditional notion of landed gentry and aristocracy are bankrupt for Waugh. It's like, what are you trying to do? Yet at the same time, those who are trying to undermine it and bring in change and modernism are also despicable, which in the end, and satire has a way of doing this, leaves well, then what is there? He almost equally slays both sides in a way. So in a way, yes, Waugh has affection for that kind of traditional order, aristocracy and stuff, but at the same time, he knows you can't go. It's a bankrupt thing to try to return to it. But what's it being replaced by, I think, is a thing that concerned Waugh a great deal.
Well, it should. Well, anyway, let's talk about two things that are of interest to me, and I think you. One is, you said this, you teach a course in these subjects. You picked this book as one of the key. How did it have a profound effect on your personal life, and what about others? The book's been around now for 70 years. So it must have had a lot of effect, and people have written about that effect.
Well, personally, on me, like I said with the story, how it was introduced to me by Mrs. Garber, my AP English teacher, was an ex-nun who had a bone to pick with the church.
With the church, right.
And so a funny part of that story is because I found myself fascinated by the novel. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, one thing is when you read a great novel, particularly when you're young, you want to talk to other people about it. I couldn't find other people to talk about, right? Yeah. But I was, since I had this sort of fascination with Sebastian, we had to everybody had to choose a confirmation name. I chose the name Sebastian.
Oh, yeah, good.
Well, yeah, also a little bit silly. It's based on a fictional character, and I was like only doing it because I thought he was a fascinating character. And I remember telling Bishop Razaza after my confirmation that's why I chose that name, and he gave me a really quizzical look as if I'd said something dirty.
Yeah, right.
Everything. And in retrospect, now I'm like, years later, I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that was a little bit of a useful indiscretion there. But for me, again, personally, what happened is that after college, I saw the Granada television version of it. I watched it, and I went, oh, I got to return. And like I said, it was like one of the only times that a film or television adaptation deepened my appreciation of the novel. And I went back to it, and I found some of these threads that we've been talking about, that even though, again, it's not like the novel is depicting Catholicism. I mean, here it is, here it is, here it is. It's showing it in the workings of kind of the way a novel does. Everyday lives of people who happen to be aristocrats and, eccentrics and things of that sort. But to me, personally, it was a novel that I kept returning to because I did identify with something in it. And what I identified with is that Waugh is capturing the fact that faith is difficult.
Have others said the same thing? Other scholars, other people who've read this novel?
So, some have. So this is what often happens with both the reception of this novel when it came out and all the way up into this day. Obviously readers have come back. It fell out of favor in the 60s and 70s, readers, and then the television, 1981 series sort of brought it back. But critics have always been very divided on Brideshead Revisited. Those who have Catholic sympathies tend to say it's Waugh's masterpiece. But then there's a lot of authors and critics in 1945 when it came out and up to this day that think that the Catholicism, is goofy, heavy-handed, and particularly they tend to point to the last 30 to 40 pages, which even some of his supporters had trouble with, which...
The death of Lord Marchmain.
Right, where everything is coming to this sort of climax of Lord Marchmain is returning home to die. He'd been banished kind of in exile because he denied his faith, and was in disgrace. But he returns, and the deathbed conversion. There's many pages of the debate between Julia and Charles and the rest of the family. Should we let the priest in or not? The last rites, which is where Charles, to me, is the most hostile and pig-headed with it. It's witchcraft, it's voodoo, it's mumbo jumbo. But the scene where then the priest comes in and does the last rites, and Lord March and everybody prays, including Charles, who finds, despite himself, he starts to kneel and say, "Please, God," and he does. He slowly does it. There's many critics who say, "Oh, God, why did he do that?" Kind of thing. And then, of course, it's followed right after, it's followed by Julia, who, and you can see it coming, makes the decision, I can't marry you, Charles. Who recognizes I'm in sin, and I'm returning to my faith, and you're not part of that. But then it's followed really quickly after that, and critics have a hard time with this too, where we're led to believe that after this Proustian kind of reminiscence, Charles revisits the derelict chapel at Brideshead, and he gets it. And the idea is that he's converted now at the end of the novel. It doesn't say he has, but
it's pretty obvious.
It's obvious, yeah. Critics can't, there's a lot of division about how to read these climactic moments. Some even saying it's kind of proselytizing or propaganda or just bad writing, bad literature. George Orwell, who wrote loved Waugh satires, and I can't remember exactly how he put it, but he wrote a review, right? And where he was reading the novel, and he liked it enough, he thought it was fun, and then when the Catholic stuff started coming in, he's kind of going, but Waugh's a great satirist. He's gonna come out and pull the rug out from under all this.
He went
and
the other
to
way.
his dismay, Orwell claimed he believes it. He's taking it seriously. Orwell was disgusted by that. That it felt like a betrayal, I think, maybe for him and others. So there is, and you still see it today. It's not as maybe polarized as it was in 1945 when the novel came out. It was a commercial success when it came out in 45, partly because there was a nostalgia for a bygone era while people were suffering through revelations of the Holocaust, the end of the war, atomic bombs, things like that. So,
there's one more thing before we wrap it up, that is the dynamics of the family. Actually, probably the lack of, what caused Charles to be what he is. He was motherless, really, because his mother died so young, and his father had his father was the coldest fish I've ever seen.
Hilarious,
wonderfully
Funniest
hilarious, but
scenes.
just totally cold. And the same problems of the Marshmain family. All of these kind of distant, cold parents, not reflecting love of their children, maybe Lady Marshmain trying. Where do those family dynamics play out in this literature, certainly, and Catholic literature in general?
Well, I think, one, it points to Waugh's finger on what we might call modern alienation, period, which is hitting the home now, kind of thing. Everybody becoming disconnected, alienated from one another. But in the novel, you're right, Charles is drawn to the Floyd family, and he even says this in narration, I never really had a family of my own. And don't forget, his mother died. The effects of World War I, again, are huge in the novel. His mother died in the war. She was an ambulance driver.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so she was killed in the war. And you have a lot of people bereft from the war. So Charles is kind of orphaned in a way. His father is not there. But although the mutual dislike of Charles and the father is very funny in the novel.
Yes, it is.
So,
It's
but
so
the,
interesting.
but the Marshmain family, it's evident that there is a family there, right? And Charles likes it. That they do come together in need. They go out to search for Sebastian, who's in trouble. Maybe Lady
They're sending him money.
Yeah, and Lady Marshmain's methods probably didn't help Sebastian, but there is.
She tried.
There is, yeah. No, there is. But how could I put this? I don't know if the whole notion of family love is necessarily something that Waugh wants us to think about that much. If I could put it this way, I'm going to be a bit challenging here and suggest that Waugh kind of thinks again in terms of the difference between feeling happy and the notion of, well, what is the truth, or
truth.
the fulfill or reconciliation, or those things. And I'm just going to throw this out. I mean, one, as far as I know, Jesus never said to anybody, "Come follow me, and I'll make you happy."
That's right.
Or we're going to have some fun, kind of thing. But another thing is that Jesus never had anything. Never, as far as I know, in the Gospels, never had any warm things to say about nuclear family. I mean, right there in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Stop going around patting yourself on the back because you love your brother and your sister. It's like patting yourself on the back because you love chocolate. You have to go out and love the stranger, the enemy. We're all a fan. It's a fan, and that's what kind of makes it interesting. Is you notice that there is a family, but there's a kind of extended family. Charles is made part of the family. He's expelled for a while. His expulsion at first is pretty painful, then brought back in. But and I know I'm putting out perhaps a challenging interpretation of it with that, but to me, it strikes me that there's a calling going on in the novel that you see too when Charles talks to Nanny Hawkins. Sebastian's only person Sebastian feels affection for his nanny at Brideshead, who always fills in about what they're doing. And it's not family dynamic stuff he keeps talking about, but it's always, at that point, what is Julia doing now for the war effort? Mm-hmm. How is she helping out the refugee problem? Cordelia's off, I forget what Cordelia is doing. She's off helping food drives.
Yeah, well, she became a nun or something like that.
Oh, no. She's, Cordelia is a wonderful character that unfortunately gets downplayed because of all the characters, Cordelia, even though Charles likes to depict her as unfortunate Cordelia, never got married, became kind of frumpy and all that. Mm. But when you meet Cordelia and in her talking in here, particularly what Waugh claims to be the most important passage, the long story she tells Charles towards the end of the novel about Sebastian, Cordelia is the only character in the novel who has no judgment of people, who embraces anybody.
Yes. Who
loves anybody for what they are, who tells Charles right off, I finished trying to convert you, but I still love you, and all that, who takes people warts and all, which dismays Charles when her attitude towards Sebastian is, when Charles says, well, how will it end? He's hearing these stories about Sebastian, just sort of like ending up in monasteries and then going back out and drinking. And Cordelia says, I'm pretty sure I know what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. He's just going to keep doing this, and then they're going to find him dead outside in front of the monastery. Right. But I love him. So there's a generosity Cordelia has that's remarkable in the novel. She accepts her sister, Julia, despite the fact she doesn't agree with her, extramarital, shenanigans. We didn't really talk about Julia, obviously. It was, and partly it's because Waugh has a hard time depicting women. I never thought Julia was a very well-developed character in a novel, even though she's very important. Yeah. But he did do a good job with, I always say, one should return to Cordelia. She's a fascinating figure. Look at what she says to Charles at the end of book 1 about vocation. And she's upfront with Charles. I thought I had vocation, and she has awareness enough of herself to say, I know that I'm actually not called because I'm just too precocious. I'm too meddlesome. So I know that God is asking me probably to do something else, kind of thing. She's a wonderful character.
She is.
In there, so.
Peter Sinclair, you're a lot of fun to talk to.
I hope so.
Sacred
Thank you.
Heart University
it was a pleasure talking about this.
Blessed to have you. Let me just tell you who are watching, this is the first one of this wonderful series that was invented here in the Diocese of Catholic novels and Catholic books. Yes. And so we're experimenting a little ourselves. Yep. But to say thank you to you, but to let you know, we've said this book, Brideshead Revisited, is well worth reading. Many people in the 21st century haven't read it. But the second is that TV series that we put on public television in the 1980s is mind-blowing. It's so good. The two together are fabulous. There is a 2009 movie. Do not watch that movie. Yeah, okay, that'll atrocious. Send you off in a different direction. Whoever made that movie must not have read the book. But at any rate, they don't seem to make that work. So we say don't read that. And maybe watch the movie watch the TV series and then read the book. And then maybe, like me, I'm going to come back and take your class, Peter.
You're more than welcome to.
And thank you for this time together.
Thank you, too. This was a great pleasure.
I
could talk for hours, but honestly,
it was fun.
It was fun. Yeah. Thanks, Bill. That was fun.
It was fun, wasn't it?
Yeah.